Hey everybody, welcome to the Daily Dose. And this week on the Daily Dose, here's what we're going to do. We are going to talk all about peace. On Christmas, we invite this Jesus into our lives whom we call the Prince of Peace. But for whatever reason, it seems to me that finding peace is harder, maybe now, than ever. And so today, what I want to do is to ask a simple question. How is it that we find peace in 2021? As we turn the page on 2021 and head into 2022, where do we find peace? How do we find peace? Because you know as well as I that our lives have been disrupted over the last year, the last 2 years in ways we could have never anticipated. A global pandemic has turned our lives upside down, and it seems just not to ever want to go away. We've seen ugly politics. We've seen racism in ways that some of us have never experienced it before. We've seen gun violence play out on TV. I mean, folks, where in the world do we find peace amid all of that? Well, I don't know if it brings any comfort to you, but as I peruse the history books, it seems to me that we aren't the only people who have had our lives disrupted through history. I mean, I talked to some of our folks who have been around for a while, and they remember growing up amid the 1930s, amid the Great Depression. I was talking with a dear lady in our congregation who remembers growing up on the Mississippi River. And when there were floods on the Mississippi River, her family would go down to the Mississippi and they'd pull out furniture and things that came floating by. They'd dry it out and they'd use it because that's what life was like in the 30s. They didn't have anything. You think about the 40s. My grandfather spent the 40s on a military base in the Aleutian Islands, not because he chose to, because he was drafted into World War II. You see, people had their lives totally disrupted. Our country was totally turned upside down amid the 1940s and World War II. 50s, some of you know quite well, was the Korean War. The 60s, our country was turned upside down and inside out by the Vietnam War that went into the 70s. And in the 70s, we had the resignation of a president. We had ugly politics. We had an oil embargo that had people in line down the street hoping they could fill their tank with gasoline. You see, it seems to me that we aren't the only ones who have lived through circumstances that were not of our choosing. And so here's what I want to wonder about. What if it's not our circumstances that steal our sense of peace, but rather our circumstances simply reveal a lack of peace that we already had? Can I say that again? What if it's not our circumstances that rob us of that peace that we long for, but rather it's those unfortunate circumstances that inevitably affect all of us that reveal the lack of peace that already existed inside us? You see, during our everyday, ordinary lives, put 2021 and 2020 aside, put a global pandemic aside and all we've lived through, think about our everyday, ordinary lives. For most of us, we have a great family, or at least a family you love. You've got kids. You've maybe got a job, and it's not your favorite job, but it puts food on the table. It puts a roof over your home. But even amidst that, even amidst having the things that we would suggest are most important, aren't we all sort of taught that, peace is hard to come by? It seems even when we have the things that we claim are most important to us, we lack peace. And we feel afraid, right? We feel afraid that our house isn't big enough. We're not keeping up with the Joneses. We're anxious if we have kids. We're anxious that we're not giving them the opportunities to be as successful as we think they should be. We compare our kids to our neighbors' kids. We feel unsettled in our work because we feel we're not climbing the ladder fast enough. We worry, am I a good enough parent? Am I being a good enough grandparent? Amid all that, where do we find peace? Where do we find peace? Not just in 2021, but where do we find peace ever amid all those circumstances? Well, here's what I want to suggest. We have to ask a question. Where are we looking for peace? Where are we looking for peace? What would peace look like? Because here's the truth of the matter, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news. If you believe that peace is found in the absence of problems, newsflash, you're never going to find it. If you believe that peace is found in the absence of problems, you will never, ever know peace. I think a great analogy for peace is the image of a sailboat. I've always wanted a sailboat, and sailboats, you can change all kinds of things about a sailboat, but there's one thing you can't change, and it's something that you may never see when it comes to a sailboat. It's what's under the water. In the center of a sailboat, down below the center of a sailboat, is this thing called the keel. And you may or may not know this, but a keel, get this, you may never see it, but it actually weighs, get this, 30 to 40% of the total weight of a boat. It's this massive, generally a massive piece of steel, and without a keel hanging down underneath a sailboat, it's going to tip instantly. You will never, ever be able to have a peaceful trip in a sailboat without a keel. Now, here's what I think. For most of us, we try and find peace by changing all kinds of things in our lives. I mean, like a sailboat, you can polish it up. In our own lives, we can have the best good looks. We can have the best image in our community. With a sailboat, you can have a fancy cabin. Just like you and I, we can have a fancy big old home on the lake. You can have a big, colorful sail. Just like you and I can be the most popular people in town. A sailboat, you can actually put a motor on a sailboat to help you get from here to there. You don't even need to use the sail. And you and I can have all the toys in our garage that we could ever dream of. You can have a mast that's made of steel or made of wood. You can have a steering wheel. You can have a wooden rudder on a boat. You can have, in our own lives, the perfect kids, the perfect family, the perfect spouse. But here's the truth of the matter. Just like a sailboat without that keel, in our own lives, we will never know peace if we don't have that one thing that guides us, that keeps us upright. The one thing that promises to give us peace. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14, the author of that book, his name was Paul. He is absolutely clear on what brings us peace. He says, this Jesus is our peace. It's the one thing that keeps us upright in the midst of everything we face, whatever circumstances we face. And we will no doubt face circumstances again and again and again in this life. But Paul says, this Jesus, he is our peace. He's our keel, if you will. You see, we're getting ready to celebrate Christmas. And if there's one thing we want you to remember this week, is that this Jesus came, and he had all kinds of names. But even when the prophet Isaiah spoke of this coming child, he used these words. He said, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given. The government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Folks, thanks so much for joining us today for the Daily Dose. I hope today this message brings you peace. And if there's someone in your life who's wrestling, who's struggling to find peace, would you share this with them? If you're watching this on Facebook, you can simply share it. If you're watching on YouTube, copy the link, share it with somebody else. And we'd love for you to hit the bell if you're watching on YouTube so you get notifications. If you're watching on cable access, hey, invite a friend to watch with you.